Occasionally, it has been passed from an AIDS-carrying surgeon to a patient.
With no cure in sight and with thousands of men dying from AIDS, gay activists stepped up.
The AIDS epidemic engrossed America, but beneath the surface were conflicts between AIDS advocacy groups, pharmaceuticals, and the government. The HIV/AIDS crisis was intertwined with triumphs and tragedies regarding treatment availability and activist groups such as Project Inform and ACT UP. The triumphs came directly from the activist fight for equal access to treatment. The tragedies surrounding this epidemic consisted of prolonged drug trials and approval, for-profit pharmaceuticals, and divisions between the activist and scientific communities, which ultimately led to many deaths. Beginning in 1957 Germany, a morning sickness medication called thalidomide was released across the world with a booming popularity. The US was excluded because the FDA refused to authorize the drug in America due to inadequate testing. Severe birth defects were found to be associated with thalidomide, and it was banned throughout the world by 1962.
It was understood to be harmless, but had actually quite devastating teratogenic effects on embryos and on infants.
This tragedy showed the value of rigorous drug evaluations and created precedent for the FDA's right to rigid protocols. Moving forward to the 1980s, the FDA's standard human drug trial procedure was to test the drug alongside proven drugs as a control variable. Although with AIDS drug trials, there were no comparable treatments, thus many patients were made to take placebos.
In fact, you were asking people in the placebo arm to die for the purpose of showing that other people did not. And that's kind of a difficult thing to ask people to do. Get into a trial, hope that they were not in the placebo arm, but everybody was hedging their bets. But if people had no therapeutic options, I think people were thinking, well, I'm going to hedge my bets, I'm going to try compound Q10 in addition to what they're giving in the trial. When you're in a trial, you can't take anything else because how would the researchers know the positive outcome wasn't due to something that you weren't telling them about?
This led to corrupted evidence in trials and a further extended time for AIDS drug approval.
They were running against a very bureaucratic but appeared to be an incredibly formalized system set up by the FDA.
The activists now knew they couldn't be complacent on the issue of AIDS drug approval.
Activists have been demanding that the agency loosen up its regulations and allow access to experimental drugs.
We demand access to these medications, and we therefore are willing to risk a certain legal prosecution by smuggling the drugs from Mexico into the United States.
Activist groups like Project Inform went abroad to get experimental treatments because of the lack of approved drugs. They operated their own drug trials to give hope to people living with AIDS.
If the FDA does not release accelerated trials or approval processes, people will get drugs by other means. In the name of safety, it's only logical to have an accelerated process.
The entrance of AZT into the market was a triumph from the struggles of activists for faster drug trials and approval times. What followed was another conflict with a new beast, the pharmaceutical industries.
Next, ACT UP took on industry. They've repeatedly accused drug maker Burroughs Wellcome of price gouging on its antiviral drug AZT.
The work of activists against strict FDA protocols led to the release of AZT in 1987, which provided hope to many, as was the first drug approved to fight AIDS. But the price of a year's worth of AZT was close to $10,000. This was due to Burroughs Wellcome Pharmaceuticals' for-profit patent on AZT.
Pharmaceutical companies' main interest is with their stakeholders and the maximization of their profit.
This led to activist backlash and protests to lower the price. They were being excluded from treatment they had helped approve through drug trials.
William Burroughs only ended up with rolling out AZT at that time because activists had made it possible.
This led to activist backlash and protests to lower the price.
This protest was very successful, and William Burroughs very immediately slashed the price.
Prices of AZT were dropped by 20% due to protests and new competition in the AIDS medication market. While AZT is an effective treatment, it induced horrible symptoms due to the prescribed high doses. The Concord program also proved in 1993 that it was no better to begin AZT treatment at diagnosis versus later on as HIV progressed. Even with the release of protease inhibitors in 1996 that allowed survival rates to soar, pharmaceuticals kept prices high and drugs inaccessible. Activists fought the inaccessibility of AIDS treatment by lobbying Congress to create financial aid programs like the Ryan White Care Act in 1990. This program was meant to combat the socioeconomic barriers that made HIV/AIDS treatment and healthcare inaccessible.
AIDS activists go to Congress to lobby for increases in the Ryan White Fund. Congress would raise the amount of money in the Ryan White program, and then in months, all the drug companies would raise their prices to what the Ryan White went up.
Now, they had to bridge the gap between the activist and scientific communities in order to increase HIV/AIDS drug accessibility.
It was an incredibly difficult time in the AIDS epidemic because it's that time when AZT clearly doesn't work, no other medication is in sight, and it's one of the years with the highest death rates.
Miscommunication and feelings of exclusion had been growing throughout the 1980s between the activists and the researchers. Frustrations climaxed in the 5th and 6th International Conferences on AIDS in 1989 Montreal and 1990 San Francisco.
With the first one in Atlanta, from Atlanta until 1989, these 4 conferences were conferences exclusively of health officials, representatives, the biggest amount, researchers.
There was an enormous activist presence in these 2 conferences with large-scale protests by groups Project Inform and ACT UP. In 1989, they crashed the opening ceremony in Montreal, and in 1990, ACT UP's Peter Staley was included as a keynote speaker in San Francisco. The value of activist inclusion was now realized. The scientific community integrated activist leaders into discussions to voice their concerns. This is shown through Richard Klein's role at the FDA during the epidemic.
I was from New York, and I had a lot of friends who were getting sick, who were just vanishing from the scene. And it was something that I felt like I had a lot of insight into, and I wanted to work with the community. So I took on the role of being the front guy for all these phone calls, say interaction, maybe cooperation from both sides, from activists to understand what it is that FDA does, and the people on the inside trying to understand what the plight was of these people on the outside.
In addition, activist leaders such as Martin Delaney worked with the federal government to pass Parallel Track in 1989.
He called Parallel Track, which would be a treatment track that would run parallel to the ongoing clinical trial.
Although Parallel Track was only ever used once, it is still in the books to this day. The triumphs of HIV/AIDS advocacy groups over the tragedies of unequal drug access came from a deep determination to end human suffering.
The epidemic itself just taught me fear and compassion.
Activists contributed significantly in the fight to make HIV a chronic illness, not a death sentence. They did this through petitioning restrictive FDA policies, fighting pharmaceuticals to lower prices, and communicating with the scientists and government officials to develop legislation. These issues were all fought in order to ensure the right to life. From the spirited fight of the activists, many were able to survive the AIDS epidemic and tell their stories to the next generation. This started a global initiative to eliminate HIV and to stop this epidemic from taking any more lives.